doing this right?
Yep.
Oh, there we go. Finally. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for sticking with this since I know it's getting late in the day and we've learned so many different things, so you're probably all a little fried. I'm Kay Chopard. I my title in the Women in Identity organization is U.S. Ambassador, which basically means I've kind of been the coordinator for a lot of activity and events and things that we do here in the U.S. I'm a volunteer. This is not my day job. For those of you who know me, my day job is I'm the executive director of the Qatar Initiative. So I have, though, devoted several years to helping get women in identity off the ground. And there's a lot of exciting things that the women and men who are part of the organization, I think, have really started to accomplish. And with me today is Kim. I will let Kim introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Kim Sutherland. So by day, since we're doing day and night, by day, I'm Vice President of Fraud and Identity at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. But I think all day and all night, can't stop being a woman. Women in Identity is where we spend so much time. And I just want to let you know, as I was sitting in the back and like just looking at heads in here, I think this is just such a representation of how things have improved over the many years that I've worked with so many of you in the room. There's about a 50-50 split of men and women in the room. And I was like, what in the world? And I think that's amazing. And that's kind of like what the impetus for Women in Identity was initially, was giving a venue to ensure that identity systems were created by all people. And as a result, we wanted to make sure that there were females in the room. And it's improving, not necessarily just because of women in identity, but because I think businesses and government agencies and organizations of all types see it important to have diversity in the room.
So today we'd just like to talk to you a little bit about some of the research work that Women in Identity is doing. It's called the Code of Conduct, and it's really about closing the identity gap. But I'm not sure how well all of you know the organization, so I want to give a little bit of background about Women in Identity, what we're about, what our focus is, and all of that. And then I'll let Kim talk a little bit more about where we are with the research. For those of you who may have heard some of this discussion, we want to tell you about what's happening in 2024, which is exciting, and it's really moving forward. One of the things to let you know is that this research project on this code of conduct and trying to close the identity gap really started a couple of years ago. And a lot of it, we basically chose two countries, the United Kingdom and Ghana, trying to pick a developed nation and one that is less developed. We focused in the financial sector, right? So it's very focused on financial access and fintech types of issues. And it also began with some one-on-one, boots on the ground interviews, conversations, research happening. And I'm not going to go into all of what that initial sort of foundational research was, but just to tell you that it included interviewing multiple people in those two countries and actually videotaping those interviews. And they're available. The Women in Identity has a YouTube channel, and I would encourage you, if you have a chance, to go and just listen to some of those to kind of get a sense from, kind of like Ava earlier today was hoping to have a victim to be able to come and talk about that. You really get a better sense about all the ways that this identity exclusion, if you will, really impacts people, often in ways that we don't always think about. So the interviews that I talked about and a lot of the initial base for the research really looked at the fact that over 6 million adults in the UK cannot prove their identity, and that one in over 1.1 billion people worldwide have that same issue. And I think sometimes here in the US, we think, oh, that's not really a very big group of people. And I think what we're finding from our research, it's a lot more people than you might have thought. And Jeremy was really good about bringing in the pastor from the Foundry Church with their specific identity ministry, if you will. That just points to the fact that, in fact, it's much more prevalent than you think. And the fact that more places are looking to create something like that is because there's a real need there.
Yeah, one thing I would just say is that we typically think about it during election time in the US, right? Because some states have ID laws and those kind of things, but it's an issue that impacts, you know, when you're trying to do a password reset and you have to go down an alternate path and they say, well, please provide a government issued ID. It's obviously an issue when you try to open a bank account. It has so many impacts beyond just voting rights. But when they did the voting studies, they said there was something like 30 million people in the US, but when 30 million voting eligible people in the US. So if you take out the citizen component of it, we're probably talking about 60 to 80 million people in the United States that have instability with being able to produce a government issued ID, photo ID.
So the initial research that we did was called the human impact of identity exclusion. And there were 5 sort of key findings that I just want to summarize for you. One of the findings, this is probably not surprising, or maybe it is, the user is at the center of the ID ecosystem. Sometimes we're so busy with our solutions that we forget the fact that the user has to be the central focus. The second thing that we found is that one size does not fit all. And we had to acknowledge a changing of social norms of what's acceptable and what isn't. And they certainly interviewed folks who were transgender and other types of choices for their lives that made it very difficult sometimes to be able to get an identity. We also found that it's really important, if we're going to try to move in the right direction, is to reduce the burden on the user. So some of the things that came out was moving towards vouching, moving towards a tiered KYC and an eKYC. Those were some trends that we saw in that initial research. We also found that better delegated authority would really help in this area of exclusion, where the identification may be individual, but since we live in networks of people who know us, and some of you I'm sure do work globally. I certainly found this in some other countries that I've worked with where that becomes even more critical. And we also really felt that one of the key findings was that we need to build a diversity and identity, or identity-based design, also in the development teams, right? So it's not just in the solutions, but in the teams that you put together to try to tackle these solutions, that you have that kind of diversity. The vision for the organization overall is that digital identity solutions that are built for everyone are also built by everyone, going to that inclusion. And the mission is to drive the digital identity industry to build solutions with diverse teams to promote universal access, which enables civic, social, and economic empowerment around the world. Just a couple more things about the organization, and then I'll let Kim talk about where the research is now and where it's headed. First of all, who we are. In the US, Women in Identity is a nonprofit membership organization. We also have a registered legal entity in the UK. So those are the 2 main sort of legal entities that exist, but our membership is actually worldwide and very global. There is a global executive board with representatives from multiple countries. Kim serves on that board. I did at one time, and I've abdicated and let them take over. I did, I left them all. And an advisory board. And the global reach that we have now is really through volunteers like Kim and I, right? And it's a small but very dedicated group. And in an effort to reduce barriers to participation, the actual membership in Women in Identity is free. There is no cost to becoming a member. So I encourage any of you here to take a look on the website and join. And you'll start to get our publications and be invited to events. And I think really get a chance to hear more about what's happening in the field. And then the last thing is that in order to be able to work on complicated issues, which, as you know, these are, we really look to companies who recognize the importance of diversity and who are willing to stand up and help support these efforts so that we can really begin to make changes in the identity industry. So we really, in terms of financial support, look to companies to partner with us. We are funded, like I said, not by member dues, but by that kind of corporate support. We're actually launching a fundraising campaign this Friday. So we'll talk about that in a minute as well. I mentioned our global reach. We have over 3,000 members and supporters right now, given that we've only been in existence about 3 years or not quite 3 years. We're excited about that growth. We have a team of about 28 volunteers like us. We are doing about 30 plus member events. That's one of the things that we do with a lot of our corporate sponsors, and we do very specific events with them. And we actually have membership and interactions and work in about 45 countries right now. So that's kind of who the organization is. And I've talked a little bit about the initial research in the Code of Conduct, and I'll let Kim talk some more about where we go from here.
Sure. So we have about 30 corporate sponsors for the overall organization, Women in Identity. But for the Code of Conduct, there's actually only a handful, and that's a separate sponsorship. So I just want to make sure I don't miss any of the names, but GBG, KPMG, MasterCard, the Open Identity Exchange, Amit Network, and RBC are the sponsors currently of the Code of Conduct. And to be able to get this research completed, we need more help, right? So this is a begging campaign. So if you know of companies that are interested in trying to help and support this type of research, what I love is the issue around equity and identity. So inclusion and identity is a new thing. We've always talked about it for years around credit inclusion. But now, including NIST in the latest guidelines, had an area around equity in the -4 draft versions. And I think that's really exciting to see. We have my customers ask, is this form of verification or this form of authentication going to disproportionately impact a certain segment of my population, right? So are you too reliant on address data? Are you focused more on, and that person happens to be address unstable? Or are you relying on the use of a driver's license and that person may not have a driver's license? So thinking about that concept, I think it's really important from an identity standpoint. And we often come up with secondary flows and alternate flows as organizations, but are those equivalent in terms of the convenience factor or the security impacts to it? So I just think that a lot of the conversations we've had today kind of feed directly into this whole concept around identity, inclusion, and equity in identity. So what we've done is we had to first start with the problem statement, right? The better that you can define the problem, the more likely we can solve it, right? So we spent a lot of time really trying to develop the problem statement. And then we did a human impact of exclusion report that was driven a lot by the videos that Kay talked about. So again, please, if you have not seen any of the videos, I highly recommend that you kind of just listen to the stories. Sometimes someone may have had a situation where they have been recently or previously incarcerated and they had a challenge with their identity. It could be somebody who has a disability where they have more challenges understanding the processes. Many of you all know that I have a 101-year-old grandfather. And if I didn't take over some of his activities, although he is independent and believe I do not take over too much now, but he needs assistance with processes sometimes that are more, he's not computer savvy, believe it or not, he's 101. But there's a lot of people like that, right? That have more challenges around being able to follow new processes in place. So that's the kind of things that you hear in the videos. So it's really interesting to kind of go back to that. So we took the videos and then we did more work on the actual human impact report. And then the other thing is that we did a literature review. And so all of that is available for you all to digest now. And we've now on the next phases. And the next phases are really interesting because we're also needing to really complete the economic impact. And we're working with a couple of universities in both the UK and the US to really help us in trying to look at the impact to our economies when you can actually have properly ID'd individuals and able to engage in processes that all of us use every day. We also are doing some design research, right? Because ultimately we're going to have the full code of conduct. And so we have a lot of roundtables that are being developed for 2024 and 2025. And getting that kind of feedback is going to be really, really critical. And then the last thing is the implementation framework. So those are the components that we're working on. And I mean, the goal is, again, since like the NIST guidelines are also including things around equity, having all those things dovetail together, I think is going to be really powerful. So that is where we stand right now. We do have a call to action where we're just trying to get more people to be aware of the work and then in support of the work. So if those are things that you might be interested in, we definitely would recommend talking to us afterwards, really kind of pushing the effort around. We don't want to see any of these equity components removed out of guidelines. And if you are responsible for any types of standards or guidelines, add those into yours as well. I think that it's just an area that shows just the maturity of the identity space. Like I said, that's been something that's always been included for years in credit worthiness and credit assessments, right? To see if there's any disparities, but now we're seeing that for identity, and I think it's a great thing. Anything else? I'd love to ask, to see if you all have any questions then. Anybody?
Oh, there's one in the back there.
We have
The
folks
people online though.
Yeah, the people online can't hear you.
And then from an equity standpoint, in case someone that has hearing issues.
Got it. I was gonna say a little bit of a softball. So Kay and I have talked about this before, that one of the things they also do is they have a job board. And one of the questions I have is, we have a couple postdoc opportunities in identity forensics. And I'm wondering, is there an easy way, like it's just a link at this point? Are there easy ways where if there are opportunities to make sure that we are looking at sort of inclusiveness and getting it to the broadest possible audience, what's the best way to sort of just get that in front of people who may be interested?
No, that's a great question. So, right now we do have for our sponsors of Women in Identity, we do have a jobs board, and we let them post our jobs to make available to those 3,000, which by the way, our goal for 2024 is to actually get up to 4,000 members. So again, please sign up. But we don't have a process right now that I'm aware of non-sponsors putting jobs. But I think that, again, how do you get that to the broadest audience? I think it's something that I can definitely bring back to find out if we can just make things available for anyone so that we can have the broadest coverage. And I know for me, like whenever we're doing hiring, I'm a slow hirer intentionally, because if I get a slate of people that all seem, let's say, homogenous, then I want to try to, force my HR teams to take a little longer and, expand their nets. So I would love to be able to add more jobs. Any other questions or comments? Think the code of conduct is a good idea? All right, well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Hey, Kim, thank you. Really appreciate you coming to speak today.